Okay, so let's start with the lecture. The conduct of monetary policy, as can seen in the figure 14.3, the market for bank reserves. The x-axis measures the quantity of reserves held on the deposit at the Fed. The y-axis measures the federal funds rate. The bank's demand curve for the reserve is RD. So as you can see from the figure, the federal funds role was at 2.50, which has decreased with the passage of time from 1 reserves on deposits at Fed to at least 5. Okay. Looking at the figure in the detail, there is a target of 1.75% at an arrow of RS. Then there is a target of 1.50% at RS1. The discount rate is around 2 and the interest rate on reserves has decreased to 1.50. Moving on, the interest rate that the Fed pays on reserve is 1.5%. The discount rate is 2%, which has decreased to 0.5 percentage points above the interest rate on reserve. The blue band is the corridor. To hit the federal funds target at 1.7%, the Fed uses open market operations to make the supply of reserves RS naught. In recent years, the Fed funds target has been at the bottom of the corridor. To hit this target, the Fed has made the supply of reserves RS1. Quick overview. When the Fed lowers the federal fund rate, it buys certificates in an open market. Other short term interest rates and the exchange rate fall. The quantity of money and the supply of loanable funds increase. The long term real interest rate falls. Consumption, expenditure, investment, and net exports increase. Point 5, the aggregate demand increases. Point 6, real GDP growth and the inflation rate increases. When the Fed raises the federal fund rate, it sells its securities in an open market and the ripple effects go in the opposite direction. The figure provides a schematic summary of these ripple effects, which stretches over a period between 1 and 2 years. So the figure shows the monetary policy transitions. The Fed lowers the federal funds rate target. The Fed raises the federal funds target rate. The Fed buys securities in an open market operations. The Fed sells securities in an open market operations. Short-term interest rates fall and the exchange rate falls. Short-term interest rate rises and the exchange rate rises. The quantity of money and supply of loanable funds increases. The quantity of money and supply of loanable funds decreases. The long-term interest rate falls. The long-term interest rate rises. Consumption, expenditure, investment, and net export increases. Consumption, expenditure, investment, and net export decreases. Aggregate demand increase. Aggregate demand increase and aggregate demand decreases. Then real GDP growth and the inflation rate increases and the real GDP growth and the inflation rate decreases. Further moving on, the Fed lowers the federal funds rate target and the Fed increases. So the interest rate changes. In the figure shows the fluctuations in three interest rates: the federal fund rate, the 3-month treasury bill rate, and the long-term bond rate. Zooming on the picture, the long-term bond rate is at 8, which has decreased to almost 4. The yellow line, the 3-month treasury bills was high at around 6, which can be seen with at a stationary tree position increasing and decreasing, finally lowered at 0.5 in year 2015. Same is the case with federal funds rate, which is moving in parallel. Again, the short-term bill rate and other short-term rates follow the federal fund rate. Long-term rates move in the same direction as the federal fund rate, but are only loosely connected to the federal funds rate. Exchange rate fluctuations. The exchange rate responds to the change in the interest rate in the United States relative to the interest rates in other countries. The US interest rate differential, but other factors are also at work which make the exchange rate hard to predict. Monetary policy transmission, bank and bank loans. When the Fed lowers the federal funds rate, the quantity of money and the quantity of bank loans increase. Consumption and investment plan change. The long-term real interest rate, equilibrium in the market for loanable funds determine the long-term real interest rate, which equals the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation rate. The long-term real interest rate influences expenditure plans. Expenditure plans, the ripple effects that follows a change in the federal fund rate, change three components of aggregate expenditure: consumption expenditure, investment, net exports. A change in the federal fund rate changes aggregate expenditure plans, which in turn change aggregate demand, real GDP, and the price level. So the Fed influences the inflation rate and the output gap. The Fed fights recession. When inflation is low, the output gap is negative. The FOMC lowers the federal funds rate target. Zooming on the picture, the FOMC lowers the target federal fund rate, which can be seen at a decrease from 3 to 2. And then the New York Fed conducts an open market purchase to increase the supply of the reserves and hit the federal funds rate target, which has moved from 50 to around 60%. So again, an increase in bank reserves increases the supply of money, the interest rate falls, and the quantity of money demanded increases from zero point 0.3 to 0.3.1. An increase in the monetary base increases the supply of money, the short-term interest rate falls. So the FMC lowers the target federal funds rate, and the New York Fed conducts an open market purchase to increase the supply of reserves and hit the federal funds rate target. An increase in the supply of loanable funds increases the long-term interest rate and increases investment. The increase in the supply of money increases the supply of loanable funds. The real interest rate falls and investment increases. So, an increase in planned expenditure increases aggregate demand, and multiplier effect is seen at point from 17.8 to 18. Which can be clearly seen in this figure. The arrows, the position has shifted to the right direction. So the Fed fights inflation. In inflation is too high and the output gap is positive. The FOMC raises the federal funds rate target. The FOMC raises the target federal funds rate from 3 to 4, and the New York Fed conducts an open market sale to decrease the reserves and hit the federal funds rate target that has moved from 50 to 25. A decrease in bank reserves decreases the supply of money, the interest rate rises, and the quantity of money demanded decreases from 0.3 to 2.9. Monetary policy transition. A decrease in the monetary base decreases the supply of money. A short-term interest rate rises, which is seen at increase from 3 to 4. The FOMC raises the target federal funds rate, and the New York Fed conducts an open market sale to decrease the reserves and hit the federal funds rate target from 50 to 25. A decrease in bank reserve decreases the supply of money, the interest rate rises, and the quantity of money demanded decreases. Monetary policy transmission. A decrease in the supply of money decreases the supply of loanable funds, the real interest rate rises, and investment decreases. A decrease in the supply of loanable funds raises the long term interest rate and decreases investment from zero point 0.1 to 0.9. Same is the case. A decrease in plant expenditure decreases aggregate demand from AD naught at 18.3 to multiplier effect from 18.2 to 18. Monetary policy transmission. The decrease in investment decreases aggregate demand, planned expenditure, real GDP decreases, and close the inflammatory gap. So, at a decrease in the supply of loanable funds raises the long-term interest rate and decreases investment from zero point 0.1 to 0.9. Same is the case. A decrease in planned expenditure decreases aggregate demand and multiplier effect is seen at 0.18. So the monetary policy transmission loses links in long and variable lags. A long-term interest rate that influences spending plans are linked loosely to the federal funds rate. The response of the real long-term interest rate to a change in the nominal interest rate depends on how inflation expectations change. The response of expenditure explains to change in the real interest rate depends on many factors that make the response hard to predict. The monetary policy transmission process is long and drawn out and doesn't always respond in the same way. Policy strategies and clarity. Two other approaches to monetary policy that other countries have used are the inflation rate targeting and Taylor rule. Inflation rate targeting is a monetary policy strategy in which the central bank makes a public commitment. One, to achieve an explicit inflation target. Two, to explain how its policy decisions will achieve that target. Several central banks practices inflation targeting and have done so since the mid 90s. Inflation targeting is a strategy that avoids serious inflation and persistent deflation. Taylor rule. The Taylor rule is a formula for setting the interest rate, calling the federal funds rate FFR, the inflation rate INF, and the output gap GAP all percentages. The Taylor rule formula is FFR is equals to 2 plus inflation plus zero point 0.5 bracket in inflation minus 2 bracket close plus 0.5% of gap. The figure shows the federal funds rate and what it would have been if the Taylor rule has been used. The figure shows the federal funds rate and if it would have been if the federal fund has been used rule. It shows two arrows, FOMC decisions and Taylor rule. The Taylor rule says that FOMC kept the federal funds rate too low for too long. Further, the monetary policy transmission, the Taylor rule says the Fed kept interest rate too long from 2001 to 2005, which fueled the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis. Then the Fed raised the interest rate too fast and too high. In 2009, the federal fund rate should have been negative. Since 2001, the Fed has been too slow to raise interest rates. The Taylor rule kept the federal funds rate too low for too long. Financial crisis cure and prevention. During the financial crisis and recession of 2008 and 2009, the Fed lowered the federal funds rate to the floor. What can the Fed do to stimulate the economy when it cannot lower the federal funds rate? The key element of the crisis. The three main events that put banks under stress are widespread fall in asset prices, a significant currency drain, and a run on the bank. During the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, the recession that followed, the Fed took extraordinary actions to limit the damage and restore stability, while Congress took actions almost all making the financial system more robust. The anatomy of the financial crisis. A financial crisis arises when many financial firms fails to pay the debts. The three events can put a bank under stress: widespread fall in asset prices, large currency drain, and a run on the bank. The Fed's policy action in crisis. The Fed's policy actions dribbled out for more than a year. The Fed conducted massive open market operations to keep the banks supplied with reserves. Congress policy actions in crisis. Extended deposit insurance authorized the Treasury to buy troubled assets from banks. These actions provided banks with more reserves, more secure depositors, and safe liquid assets in place of troubled assets. Macroprudential regulations. Macroprudential regulations is financial regulation to lower the risk that the financial system will crash. In the global financial crisis of 2008 brought this type of regulations to center stage. Macro versus micro. Macroprudential regulation seeks to lower the risk of failure of individual financial institutions. Macroprudential regulation focuses on the interconnections among individual financial institutions and market and their shared exposure to common shocks. The tools, the main macroprudential regulation tools are rules about the balance sheet of banks and other financial institutions. They are rules about ratios of loans to net worth or loans to cash and other liquid asset reserves that vary with respect to the macroeconomic environment. For example, a microprudential regulation requires banks to increase their minimum ratio of net worth to loans, while a macroprudential regulation might make that minimum ratio increase during a recession and decrease in an expansion. The main macroprudential regulation tools are rules about the balance sheet of banks and their financial institutions. They are rules about ratios of loans to net worth or loans to cash and other liquid asset reserves that vary with respect to the macroeconomic environment. For example, a microprudential regulation requires banks to increase their minimum ratio of net worth to loans, while a macroprudential regulation might make that minimum ratio increase during a recession and decrease in an expansion. Macroprudential regulation today. US regulation is centralized in the Financial Stability Oversight Council (FSOC) established in 2010. The job of FSOC is to identify threats to US financial stability and to respond to emerging crises through the US financial system. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act 2010 created the FSC and made wide-ranging changes to financial regulation. In 2017, Congress was seeking to roll back many of the provision of Dodd-Frank. Thank you for listening to the lecture. Bye.